A fundamental part of being a leader is the proper use and exercise of power. Every leadership position has with it some degree of power, and every leader has some degree of power. So the best leaders are very aware of their power base and work hard at maintaining that power base and use it very carefully and think at a conscious level about how they're going to acquire power, how they're going to use it, and how they're going to maintain it. Now, the interesting thing that I find about power and leadership is that power is also one of the things that we love to criticize leaders for. I'm sure that you've all heard leaders being criticized for being power hungry, for example, having a big ego about being powerful. So I think the question for us is to think through here the proper use of power, because we have to accept the fact that having power is a fundamental part of leading. And if you aren't comfortable having power and having some power over other people, your followers, then you're going to struggle as a leader. So by the time we get done with this chapter, we want to be thinking about what's the right way as a leader to think about power, and what's the right kind of power to be acquiring and building in our leadership. To do that, we're going to first take a look at the many different types of power that a leader can have, what we will come to call power bases. Then we're going to spend some time talking about empowerment and delegation, and that is the giving away of one's power. Because as I will talk about, there's a great paradox that comes to power and empowerment. And then we're going to talk a little bit about organizational politics, something that many of us hate, but is in fact a reality of life in every organization today. Then we'll take a brief look at ethical and unethical political behaviors, which actually is something we could spend the entire class talking about, and a little bit about how you as a leader can control dysfunctional politics in the organization. Now, it turns out that power is not a singular thing, that in fact there are many different types of power that a leader can have. And even leaders who occupy similar positions, let's say CEO of an organization, if we looked across multiple organizations, we would find their power bases being different. Clearly, they all have some power because they're CEO, but they bring with them other power bases. And in fact, when we look at leaders across society, you'll find a wide range of different power bases that these leaders use. So, if you're going to be effective as a leader in cultivating power, and ultimately in using power appropriately, you need to start to understand all these different kinds of power, so you know which ones you have, which ones you need to cultivate, which ones you don't have. And so when you start to try and use power in a situation, that you only do so when you know you have the appropriate power base. So this slide shows you a lot of different categories of power bases. And we're going to talk about each one of these categories in detail. The first category we want to talk about is what we call position power. That is, as a leader, when you are appointed to a formal position, of some type in an organization or in a political situation, in a church, it doesn't matter where, but if you're appointed to a position, that position brings with it a certain amount of power, and that's bestowed upon you the whole time you're in that position. So the first type of position power is what we call legitimate power, and that is that the lawful right to make certain decisions and expect people to comply with those decisions, that comes with usually executive level titles. And folks, we're not just talking about corporations here. You know, if the bishop in a parish makes certain decisions, then he has a right to expect others within the parish to abide by those decisions. Political leaders, if you're mayor of the city of Baton Rouge, then you're have the right and a lawful right to make certain decisions. If you're the president of a student organization or the student government president, you're asked to make certain decisions and given the right to do that. And that's what we call legitimate power. And certainly most leaders have a lot of legitimate power, at least those that are engaged in organizations or in government. Now, the second type of position power is reward power, and that is the power that comes from the ability to bestow rewards on your followers. Now, whether those rewards are things like promotions and salary increases, those are the most obvious. But there can be a lot of others that are less obvious, like the choicest assignments, whether that somebody really wants, or a project they really want to work on, or an opportunity to get special training that will help them advance further down the road. And you can see this dynamic at play even around the campus and in your student organizations. So reward power is obviously a very powerful power base for a leader to operate from. Now, the flip side of that is what we call coercive power, and that is the ability to punish people for non-compliance with the leader's directives. You know, it's interesting that leaders, organizational leaders, typically have a lot of coercive power, yet in reality, one can't advance very far as a leader if you just operate from your coercive power base. That is, by firing people left and right. You know, there's certainly tyrants that do that, but at the end of the day, when we know that if an organization is so afraid of a leader, they soon stop innovating, they soon stop extending themselves beyond the minimal to avoid the punishment. So that if we want to build great organizations, that we have to do it with reward power. But, and this is really critical, is that most organizational leaders find that they have to be seen as willing to use that coercive power, even if they don't do it very often. The fourth kind of position power that this slide talks about is what we call information power. And that is the control over information that people need. This is really prevalent in bureaucracies, where certain mid-level leaders may have access to information that senior leaders need, and oftentimes retain very tight control over that information. That's one reason that, in fact, the The internet has so changed relationships in many organizations. There was a day in the very traditional bureaucracy where a central part of middle-level managers' power base came from information power. And information trickled up through them to the senior levels. Now, in many organizations, senior executives have information systems where they can tap into information about even a single store's sale on a certain product. That in years gone by, they would have had to have sent a request down through the organization to find this out, and that very fundamentally changes the dynamics in the organization. So the next category of power here is what we call personal power. And that is the power that comes from the person, not from the position that the person is occupying. The first in this category is what we call referent power. And that is the power that comes from having desirable traits and characteristics. People want to be like that, like you. Let's think about Mohammed Gandhi. For example, people admire Gandhi because of his personal traits. He had no position, he had no position power, but a lot of his charisma came just because people would want to emulate him, and that's what we call referent power. Mother Teresa. Now, I hesitate here because referent power is not solely attached to religious figures, although often it is, but not always. Now, the second kind is expert power. Power stemming from one's expertise. This is the power base from which most professors operate. We're experts in our field, and therefore that's where a lot of our power comes from when we interact with organizations and so forth. And it's also a power base that you can start to cultivate even very early in your career by becoming expert on certain technologies or certain issues or certain problems can enable you to start to build power in your career very early. And then the third is prestige power. This is power from your status or reputation, and it usually comes from you having established some track record of success in an industry. Donald Trump trades on prestige power quite a bit, even though he's had a number of failures, certainly. And some former politicians rely on prestige power quite a bit. So you see, these three are three dimensions that follow the person, have nothing to do with the position they're in, but rather follow the individual. A third category of power is power from ownership. Now, clearly, if you own the company or own the organization, that brings with it a lot of power. But we also have to recognize that you can have ownership power just from by being close to the people that own the organization, or in the case of publicly held organizations, close to board members who represent the owners of the organization. Or if you're a big investor in an organization, or you're close to a big investor, then you pick up some of their ownership power as well. And I like that new golden rule that they state here: the person who holds the gold rules. And obviously, the place this really comes into play big time too is with family-held organizations, where a family or an individual owns a company, and that the amount of power that they have is clearly tremendous because of that ownership. Dependency power has to do with control over key resources that an organization needs. And that is, if you have control over some kind of key resource that other people in the organization need, you have a lot of power. Now, that key resource could be money, could be access to customers, could be technology, could be information. It doesn't matter. You know, one of the funny examples of this, whenever I've talked to people who've been in the military, one of the most powerful people in the military is what they call the quartermaster. And the quartermaster is the one who's responsible for getting all the supplies that a military unit needs to function. And so this is the person who gets the military everything from food and water to gasoline to run their vehicles and so forth. And they're actually quite powerful people in the military. And I've always heard military officers say that they're somebody you always want on your side because they're wheeling and dealing and negotiating to get resources for their military unit. So they have a lot of dependency power. Another power base is power from capitalizing on opportunity. Now, this comes from you or from a leader being in the right place at the right time, but becoming a problem solver or taking care of crises in the organization. So this happens when you spot a problem area, you spot a crisis either about to happen or a crisis that does happen, and you're the one that jumps in to fix it. When you do that, and if it's a significant problem or a significant crisis to the organization, then you gain power. And in fact, one strategy in your career is always to look for those opportunities, to look for the situations, the hard problems, the hard situations that other people tend to shy away from, because if you can jump in and fix them, and then you're going to gain a great deal of power over time. Strategic contingency theory basically says that units of an organization that are most critical to the organization accomplishing its strategic goals are going to be the most powerful. And so the units in the organization that either produce the products or help the company deal with its critical problems and the uncertainties it faces in the future are the ones that will be more powerful. This is why in most organizations, staff entities like human resources or accounting or legal tend to have less power than the units that make the product and serve the customers and who actually make money for the organization. And so even though the staff support organizations are critical are certainly important and critical in one sense, that in day-to-day organizational life, the units that have more power are the ones that are more directly linked to the organization accomplishing its strategic goals. And last but not least is power that comes from being close to power. That is, if you are closely aligned with a person who has a great deal of power, then you kind of get some of that person's power attributed to you. Here's the classic example. You know, in an organization, one of the persons that you really want to make sure that likes you are the senior executives' assistants. Because the assistants who work close to senior executives become very powerful in the organization because they control access to that person and they really have that senior leader's ear on various topics. And if they like you, then you'll be able to get a lot of things done in the organization. If they don't like you, conversely, then it's a real problem. So another classic example of this is the West Wing of the White House. Some of you may have heard stories how people fight over which office they're going to get because the people who are closer to the Oval Office in the White House are seen as being more powerful because they're closer to the president and they can get better access. And so you see that the both physically and in terms of bureaucratically, the closer you are to someone with a lot of power, the more power you're going to have. Now, I like the points this slide makes that are kind of close this part of the chapter. And that is that acquiring power alone does not make for great leadership. You can have a tremendous amount of power and still not be effective at using that power. Also, there's an old saying that power corrupts. And so being too ambitious about acquiring power can in fact lead to unethical behavior. And I think that's the really tricky part about power for leaders. On the one hand, you have to have power to lead, and you have to worry to some extent about acquiring power and continuing to have that power and so forth. On the other hand, power can be like a drug for a lot of leaders. And in a lot of the leaders who end up abusing their power simply could not resist the drug, if you will, that they were tempted with. And we also know that as a leader, if you're visibly ambitious about acquiring power, that you can turn off a lot of your followers. So it's a really tricky thing to balance. To balance being able to acquire power without appearing so overly ambitious and then abusing your power. So now let's turn our attention to the notion of empowerment. Now there's a great paradox with power, and that is this: the more power the leader gives away, the more power they gain. Think about that for a minute. That in fact, if you have a lot of power, rather than you simply exercising that power, the more of that you give away, ultimately, the more powerful you become. And here's why, is that the more that we empower other people, several things happen. One is they accomplish more. And the more they accomplish, the more credit that leaders get for being effective. But in addition, that the more that you empower team members in an organization, the more likely they are to want to follow you, because you're building them up rather than tearing them down. And that's why all of these tactics that we'll talk about, such as participative management, shared decision making, and delegation, and various empowerment tactics become so important in organizations. Not only does it make the organization better, but as a lead, it makes you better, stronger, and more powerful as in the last slide, we saw that the basic meaning of empowerment is simply that decision-making authority and responsibility is passed from the leader to the team or group members. But it's really useful to also think about the psychological definition of empowerment. That is, what happens psychologically when workers feel empowered. And that's what this slide is all about. And we can talk about 5 components of a psychological definition of empowerment. First, workers are going to feel more empowered when the work has meaning to them. That is, that there's meaning for them other than earning their salary or their wages. So we know that people feel more empowered when they're working for a purpose or a passion or a cause or a product that they really believe in. And that's why we talk when we talk about vision and we talk about leaders setting the vision and defining core values for an organization and a purpose for the organization. That the reason that's so important is that gives employees something to connect to that has meaning over and beyond collecting their paycheck. Secondly is competence. That people like to feel competent. They like to feel like they're able to accomplish things, to get things done, and that they have the skills necessary to do the job. The more that we can help people feel that way, the more empowered they'll feel. And if you remember back to path goal theory, that this is very similar. That when we help our followers feel competent, then they feel empowered because they're the ones that are doing things, not us. Thirdly, if workers feel like they have choices, then they'll feel more empowered. That is, instead of the leader saying, I want you to do this and that and do it in this particular way, that they're given some part of the task where they get to make the choices. And obviously, the more choices they have, the more empowered that they're going to feel. And that's why, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, but why we often talk about leaders defining the goal, but letting the workers define the methods. Fourth is impact. And that is that if workers like to feel like they're making a difference, that what they're doing and what they're accomplishing has some kind of impact. Sometimes that's impact on the customer. Sometimes that's impact on the organization. But that all of us like to walk away from a workday saying, hey, I made a difference today. That what I did had a positive impact on my organization and on our customers. And lastly is internal commitment. The more that we can get workers to have a level of commitment, of intrinsic commitment, at a personal level to the goals of the organization, the more empowered that they will likely feel. This really goes hand in hand with meaning, I think, because when workers are doing something that has meaning to them, they also tend to get internally committed to it rather than just be driven by extrinsic rewards and so forth. So if you think about these together, that empowerment happens when workers feel like the work they're doing has meaning, they feel competent in doing their work, they have choices about how they do their work, and that their work is making impact and they're internally committed to it. You can turn it around the other way and say, okay, as a leader, the more that I can help workers find meaning, the more that I can help them feel competent, the more that I can give them choices, the more that I can help them see they have impact, and the more that I can help them build internal commitment, the more that they're going to feel empowered. This figure shows 8 specific action steps that you can take to be an empowering leader, and that will lead to these 6 psychological impacts that define empowerment. First off, fostering initiative and responsibility. That one's pretty obvious, because the more that we allow people to take personal initiative and responsibility in their task, the more that they're going to feel empowered. But a lot of leaders, without realizing it, shut that down. And so leaders need to make a conscious effort to reward initiative and responsibility, and to encourage that, so that people aren't afraid to take initiative and to take responsibility. Second, link work activities to organizational goals. Boy, this is a really big one. Because I tell you what happens when you go inside organizations and you get several levels down in the hierarchy from the top. You find workers being assigned tasks that somebody up above them knows how that's connected to the strategic goals of the organization, but that gets lost in translation. And so here you have a worker somewhere in the mid-levels or lower levels of the organization who's given a task to do, and they have no clue how that's going to help the organization achieve its bigger goals. And if we just stop and take just a few minutes and explain to them, say, let me tell you how this task, as trivial as it might seem, is connected to this higher level big goal that we've been talking about. Then we've enhanced their sense of meaning and impact with what they're doing. And it has a very powerful effect on workers. And I've seen time and time again where workers say, I don't know why I'm doing this. They give me this silly stuff to do. It doesn't have any meaning. It doesn't do any good. Yada, yada, yada. It's just make work. Now, that's, quite often it's not the truth, but we need to communicate with them. And that's something we as leaders can do a lot. Ample information. In order for a workplace to be an empowering workplace, workers have to have information. That is, that we have to strive toward as much transparency as we can possibly achieve. Now, all organizations have certain information they can't fully share with everybody for a variety of very good reasons. But the point here is it's hard to be empowered and to take initiative and make decisions on your own if you don't have the information. So we need to provide as much as we possibly can. Number 4, allowing group members to choose methods is probably the classic empowerment approach. You know, I as a leader am going to still be held accountable for results. So I can't delegate that. But I can delegate the method of achieving those goals. And so the thing to do as a leader is to retain responsibility for the result, and hold group members accountable for achieving that result, but give them the leeway to determine the methods of accomplishing those goals. Number 5, encourage self-leadership. This is something I keep talking about with you all, where I just gave you feedback on the midterm about the need for you to take leadership of yourself. This is why in many organizations they talk about leadership occurring at all levels of the organization, whether you're in a formal managerial role or not, because ultimately empowerment is about everybody taking a piece of leadership role, at least of themselves. Number 6, establishing limits to empowerment. This may sound a little bit odd, but let me explain. If as a leader, I'm ultimately accountable for the end result and for the outcome, but I can't just turn people loose to do anything, because I'm accountable for certain things in the organization. So one of the things that I need to do when I give people a task and I say, okay, you can pick the method here, but here are the limits, here are the parameters within which you have to operate. Here's what I can't let you choose, but here's everything else that you can. That's what we mean by establishing the limits to empowerment. Number 7, continue to lead. Empowerment is not laissez-faire leadership. That is, empowerment is not just, here, you do the job, it's your task, your responsibility. That's not leadership. We have to continue to lead. We have to continue to coach them. We have to continue to support them. We have to continue to motivate them. We have to continue to do all the things that good leaders do, while still empowering them to get the job done. And 8th, last but not least, is we certainly have to take into account cultural differences around this notion of empowerment. Because I think you'll find around the world, with different countries, different regions, that the expectations with regard to empowerment are quite different. In the American society, we're a very individualistic culture, and consequently, empowerment fits the American way very, very much. Other cultures are much more collectivistic, where they work together as groups and teams. And so we have to be sensitive to those cultural differences when we think about empowerment. Organizational politics is a controversial topic at best. There are really two views of politics that I want to talk about for just a minute. One view, and I think the traditional view, is that it's a very negative occurrence in organizations. Most of the time when we talk about politics in organizations, it's usually in a derogatory way. Oh, that was just a political decision, or it's all about politics. It's not. As if politics is a negative, bad thing in and of itself. The other view is a more positive or charitable view anyway, which says that, well, politics is just the way that people operate in a social system whenever resources are limited and people compete for resources. And that politics or political skill is something that every leader needs to have in order to operate within an organization, and it combines some element of social awareness and ability to communicate in order to influence other people. And so I think there's an element of truth in both those views. It's just that the words organizational politics get used to mean to mean both of those, and so we get confused about them sometimes. So the negative view says that politics is when we try and gain power through means other than merit, meaning earning it, or sheer luck. And so this is what we see as people kissing up to others, currying favor, and particularly a selfish approach where you're emphasizing your own self-interest at the expense of others. This is certainly the negative view when we see people in the organization who are rising to the top, not because they do good work, but because they're somebody's friend, or they've become friendly with senior people, or even worse reasons that I'll let you fill. So politics is fundamentally how people acquire power in organizations. And there are certain factors in organizational life that somewhat unavoidable that contribute to political behavior. First and foremost is that organizations are pyramid-shaped. That is, as you move up in the organization, each level, there are fewer and fewer positions available. So as people compete for those positions, of course, there are going to be some winners and some losers. And so people will try to gain any advantage they can in order to advance up that organizational pyramid. A second factor that is avoidable, or potentially avoidable, are subjective standards of performance. That is, if standards of performance are not clear-cut and are not objective, then clearly they're open to more influence through interpersonal means. What do I mean by this? Well, let's take a sales executive who's judged solely on the sales numbers. They are what they are. Okay? He or she either does a great job or a bad job, depending on what the sales numbers are. Well, let's now take a human resources executive. How do we judge that individual? Let's say that probably in a much more subjective way about the health of the human resources in the organization. Well, the more subjective the standards are for judging the performance, the more subject they are to influence in ways other than performance. And that's where politics comes into play. Environmental uncertainty. The more uncertain the environment and the more turbulence that's happening in the organization, the more people get scared. And people will resort to any means to try and retain their jobs, to be successful, to get on the right side, the winning side. So if an organization is in the middle of trying to think about how to deal with a declining economy, for example, and we know some people are likely to be laid off, then you find a lot of political behavior taking place. Again, as people try and curry favor from different people in the organization, hoping to be on the winning side, so to speak. Emotional insecurity of individuals also contributes. That is, the more individuals are insecure emotionally, the more likely they are to need the approval of others in the organization. The next one, Machiavellian tendencies, is probably the only clear-cut dysfunctional reason for political behavior. And that is some people are just competitive. Some people are just out to get others and will win at any cost. And those people will use political means to advance themselves and not think a second thought about it. And those are the ones we call Machiavellian types. And you're going to see them in organizations. And then the last one on this list, anyway, is encouraging admiration from subordinates, and these are the leaders who, perhaps out of their own emotional insecurity, need to feel admired, and so employees who kiss up or suck up to them are encouraged or rewarded, at a minimally not discouraged. And that encourages more political behavior. So what we want to talk about are what we would consider ethical political tactics and strategies. And those really fall into three groups, and that is ethical behaviors aimed at accruing power, ethical behaviors aimed at building relationships, and ethical behaviors aimed at avoiding what would be considered political blunders. So we'll talk about each of these groups in the next slides. Okay, this list is one of what the book suggests are ethical strategies. Now, I want to tell you that there's some on this list that I think are pretty easy to abuse as well and cross over into unethical or dysfunctional. But let's talk through the list, and I'll highlight those for you. First is developing power contacts. Now, this is not, I'm sure, new to you, but it's the notion that the bigger your network and the more that you network, particularly with powerful people, remember that power base of being close to power, then the more power you will have. I think it's generally regarded as true that for every professional, networking is really critical, particularly as you're building your career. Your network will not only get you information, it will get you opportunities. The more people you know, the more powerful that you're likely to become. Now, the next two, I actually don't like the use of the term control, because controlling vital information and controlling lines of communication can also be an unethical strategy, particularly when you withhold vital information from somebody as a political tactic. I think what your author is getting at here is saying that if you are the source of vital information, you will gain power. And if you have access to lines of communication that others don't, then you will gain power. And so if you build access to information in lines of communication, you'll be more powerful. I think the word control there, to me, connotes the classic strategy of bureaucrats who control, meaning limit communication and limit access to information in order to gain personal power, and that's not ethical. Doing what the political environment demands. Again, I think you could be seen as a bit of a chameleon if you're not careful with this. But I like your example, the example that your book uses, where they talk about the European helicopter manufacturers who, in order to get the U.S. defense contract, had to put plants in the U.S. They had no choice. That enabled them to be more powerful in the bidding process. Bringing in outside experts is a way to build and bring in experts that others can't. But if these individuals come in and support your position on an issue, then they build your power. Making a quick showing is a clear way to build power early on, particularly if you're a newcomer to an organization. That is, to do something really good very quickly, so people start to see you as kind of an up-and-comer. Really critical for you as a new employee early in your career. Next one, paybacks. People expect to be paid back. If they help you, you help them. They scratch your back, you scratch theirs. Whatever metaphor you want to use. But people do expect to be paid back, and you will gain power if you're known as one who does pay others back. Being politically correct is a way, if you will, don't step in it, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment. And the last one, be the first to accept reasonable changes. This is a really touchy one because the touchy word here is reasonable. It is generally true in organizations that people tend to resist change. If you become known as one who doesn't automatically resist change, then that's a good thing, and you gain power. If you become known as one who can be an innovator or an early adopter of change, then that's a positive thing, and you will gain power. On the other hand, that you don't want to be seen as one who accepts any kind of change because you'll lose respect over that. The hard part is determining what's reasonable. And I think the best guideline that I would give is that you accept more changes than you resist. But at the same time, if it's a change that you just don't fundamentally believe is right, you have a responsibility to speak out about that as well. So it's really tricky in organizations. But it's also pretty easy to spot those in organizations who just resist change because they don't like to change. That's what you want to make sure in this slide, we talk about strategies to build relationships. When you look at this slide, I think one reaction is to look at it and say, this is just common sense stuff. And I hope it is common sense to you. But in general terms, I think what this slide highlights is that you need to be purposeful in organizations about building relationships and building your network of people who think positively about you. Now, it's important to clarify here that we're not talking in this slide about your relationships with your best friends or your social relationships. We're talking about the many, many professional relationships that you will build over your career or that you would build within a company where you really don't know each other that well, but you may be working together extensively over perhaps many years. And what I like about this slide is that it emphasizes that in order to be politically effective, you have to be able to build successful working relationships very well. And I'm only going to hit a couple of these things because some of them are common sense. But like number 2, manage your impression. A lot of what happens in organizations is about impressions. You know, it would be great if everybody had the time or took the time to get to know everybody else very, very well. But that's not the way it happens. Maybe there's somebody from another department that you only see in a meeting twice a year. Okay? Otherwise, you don't work with that person much. That person, though, is going to shape an opinion about you based on what they see in those 2 meetings. So this happens all the time in organizational life and in your life as a leader. And the really effective leaders grasp this concept and work hard at cultivating good impressions of them. And so you have, and this is very critical to new college graduates when they go into the workplace. And so you want to really work at managing the impressions you're making within the organization, because probably 90% of the relationships that you have in your professional life will be built on impressions, not on deep knowledge of you or the other person. The fourth one and I want to highlight, even though it is common sense, is be courteous, pleasant, and positive. Sounds like common sense, right? You'd be amazed at the number of people in organizations who are not this. And this is real simple. Who wants to work with negative, unpleasant people, or people who have a negative view on the world? I don't. Do you? Make it a point to just be positive and be pleasant with people at work. It goes a long way. The rest, I think, are pretty straightforward, and I'm not going to talk about each of these points here in detail because I think they're straightforward enough for you to read. But the central point of this slide, I think, is that in every organization, there are things you can do that are going to be considered political no-nos and will erode your power base. Now, the ones on this slide, things like criticizing the boss in public, are general rules that fit every organization. What I really want you to watch out for, though, are the rules, if you will, that are particular to the organization you're in. Because every organization has its own little rules that you can stumble in and make a political blunder with if you're not careful. What I always advise people is in the early days in an organization, you want to tread very carefully until you understand the rules of the game in that organization. These that are on this slide and you read about in the book, straightforward, common sense, fit in every organization. They're the easy ones, okay? So watch out, watch for the political blunders, though, that are unique to the particular organization or setting you're in. You know, this slide is an interesting list, and it presents a little bit of a dilemma for me in how I talk about it. On the one hand, I agree with your author, who labels everything on this list as unethical political tactics. On the other hand, I will tell you that most of what is on this list is a reality of everyday life in organizations. And in several cases, you would even find books that may recommend this strategy to you. So let's talk through these, and I'll illustrate what I'm talking about. Backstabbing. Well, I think just about everybody would agree that backstabbing is wrong. And what is backstabbing? Well, that's simply, as your book says, you pretend to be nice, but all the while you plan someone's demise. And so you're out to get somebody, basically. Now, like I said, is it unethical? You bet. Does it go on all the time? You bet. Are there people who are successful because they do this? Yes. So I think to suggest to you, to sit here and tell you, oh, backstabbing's unethical and you shouldn't do it, is also to present a Pollyanna view of organizational life. So I think you need to learn about it so you can learn to watch out for it too. And hopefully you can pick an organization where that's not a way of life. Now, embrace or demolish. This is one that I think is really hard. Embrace or demolish says basically if you're a leader that you expect people to either embrace your changes, what you're planning, your plans, or you demolish them. They get fired. Well, folks, this goes on every day where executives get fired because they don't agree with their boss's plans or the changes their boss wants to implement. In fact, it's standard practice for new CEOs to clean house in order to bring in their own team. And I've seen this happen in universities. It certainly happens in state and local government. It happens in the corporate world. And in fact, a commonly recommended strategy in some areas is, if you're trying to implement change, you need to take a few victims, as they say, and that is to fire a few people who don't go along with your change to make a point. So, in a perfect world, would we not do this? Yeah, but that's not real life in the organizational world. Now, setting a person up for failure, I think we can pretty well agree that that's not fair. It is done in organizations. One way to force somebody out, if you, for whatever reason, don't feel like you can just fire them, is to set them up for failure, to give you an excuse to get rid of them. Divide and rule. Well, here again, there are times where that's a very, a very common technique to divide and conquer. Playing territorial games. Boy, unethical? Probably. In a perfect world, we wouldn't act to protect our territory, whether that's the information we have, the authority that we have, the customers that we have, or whatever however we define territory. But in many ways, the essence of organizational life in every organization has a certain amount of territorial protection going on. There's an element of human nature to want to protect our territory, because our territory includes our jobs and so forth. So would I agree with your author that I'd like to get rid of it? Yeah. But I'd rather also see you become good at playing the game when you're forced into it, but I'd rather you not play it if you're not forced into it. The last one, I think, is clearly unethical, creating a false catastrophe and then resolving it in order to look like the hero or the white knight. So how do we summarize this? Well, here's the key point. The political tone of an organization is set to a large extent by the leaders in the organization. And if you don't want dysfunctional politics to be occurring in your organization, then you as a leader need to take responsibility to try and eliminate it as much as you can. So when you reach the point where you're CEO or mayor or something similar, you will have a lot of opportunity to minimize dysfunctional politics or encourage dysfunctional politics. And that's, I think, the central point that I want you to take away here. Now, this slide talks about 6 reasons that, the 6 ways that you can exercise some control over dysfunctional politics. The first one is just be aware of its causes and techniques. A savvy leader, even if you intend to be very ethical and not be a highly political leader, understands how the political games are played and can spot them happening from a mile away. And so you first have to learn the game, ironically, in order not to play it, so that you can call people out in the open when they're playing that political game rather than doing the right thing. The second is to avoid favoritism. I think that's pretty clear. Third, set the example at the top of the organization. So many things in organizations flow down from the top. And you need to set the good example. And if you don't tolerate political games, they will be minimized in the organization. They won't go away, I promise you. But they'll be minimized. Fourth, encouraging goal congruence. This is getting everybody on the same page and having the same goals and keeping people focused on the goal rather than the petty political infighting. I like number 5, threaten to discuss questionable information in a public forum. This is kind of calling people out in a public forum when there's questionable information or questionable activity going on. People don't like to be embarrassed with their political games. And last but not least, at the end of the day, the best thing you can do is hire the people with the kind of integrity that you want to see business conducted with in your organization. You can't control everything that goes on in your organization, but if you get the right people with the highest standards of integrity, then your odds of having a lot of dysfunctional politics in the organization